The wind found every gap in Margaret Coyle's coat before she'd gone a quarter-mile up the ridge, and beside her the golden dog stopped walking. Just stopped, ears up, nose working the air like something had shifted in the world that only he could smell. "What is it, Duke?" The dog did not answer, of course, but his body answered for him. His weight dropped low, his tail went still, and he turned his head toward a shelf of gray rock jutting out from the mountainside like a broken tooth. Margaret followed his gaze and saw nothing but stone and snow and the first gray curtain of the storm rolling in over the tree line. She had been a widow for 11 months. She had learned in that time to trust very little and to trust her dog absolutely. And so, when Duke began walking toward that shelf of rock instead of continuing up the trail they had walked 100 times before, Margaret did not call him back. This is the story of what they found inside that mountain, and what a woman already left with nothing discovered was hers to keep. Stay with it. It is worth the walking. 3 days earlier, the town of Hollow Creek had made its decision about Margaret Coyle, and it had not asked her opinion on the matter. She had stood in the back room of the general store, hands folded in front of her plain gray dress, while 5 men she had known her entire life explained, in careful and regretful tones, that her husband's debts belonged to her now that he was gone, and that the modest cabin she had lived in since her wedding day was collateral against those debts, and that she would need to vacate it by the week's end. "There is nothing more we can do, Mrs. Coyle," the banker had said. His name was Otis Meade, and he had once eaten Sunday dinner at her table more times than she could count. "The bank has obligations. Surely you understand." She had understood. She had understood that a widow with no children and no living family in the territory was, to men like Otis Meade, simply an inconvenience that had outlived its usefulness to the town's ledgers. "My husband built that cabin with his own 2 hands," she said quietly. "And I am sorry for your loss," Otis said, not looking sorry at all. "But sentiment does not settle debts." She had walked out of that store with her spine straight and her eyes dry, because she had learned, in the 11 months since Thomas died of the fever that took half the men on the eastern ridge that winter, that crying in front of people who wanted you gone only made them more comfortable with wanting it. She had 2 days left in the cabin. She had packed what little she could carry, tied it to the back of the 1 mule the bank had not yet claimed, and set out into the foothills with nothing but her dog, her belongings, and a stubborn refusal to beg anyone in that town for mercy they had already decided not to offer. Duke had been Thomas's dog first, a golden retriever with a soft mouth and a watchful eye, trained more for companionship than for work, though he had proven steadier in a crisis than most of the men Margaret had grown up around. When Thomas died, Duke had lain by the door for 3 days, refusing food, and Margaret had understood, in her own grief, exactly what the animal was feeling, because she felt it too. Now, 3 days into wandering with nowhere fixed to go, Duke was the one leading her somewhere, and Margaret Coyle, who had learned to trust very little in this life, found herself following a dog up a mountainside into the teeth of an oncoming storm. The shelf of rock, when she reached it, revealed itself to be more than a shelf. Behind a screen of brush and fallen stone, a dark opening yawned into the mountain itself, wide enough for a person to walk through standing upright, and old enough that moss had grown thick and undisturbed across its lower lip. "You found us a door, did you?" Margaret murmured, and Duke wagged once, low and serious, before trotting inside without waiting for her permission. She followed him in, one hand trailing along the cold stone wall, her breath fogging in front of her, as the last gray light of the afternoon dimmed behind her. The wind howled at the cave mouth like something wounded. Ahead of her, Duke's shape moved steadily deeper into the dark, unafraid, certain, the way he had once walked ahead of Thomas on hunting trips through unfamiliar country. 50 feet in, by her best guess, the passage widened into a chamber tall enough that her lantern light could not find the ceiling. And there Duke finally stopped, sat, and looked back at her as though to say that this, at last, was where they had been going all along. Margaret raised her lantern and went very still. The chamber was dry, bone dry in a way that felt almost deliberate, as if the mountain itself had carved out this one hollow space and sealed it away from the weather raging outside. Old ash sat in a blackened ring near the center of the floor, the remains of a fire built by hands other than her own, long enough ago that the wood had crumbled to dust at the edges. And against the far wall, half buried beneath a fall of loose stone, sat a chest, not large, iron-banded, dark with age, its lock long rusted to a fragile orange crust. Margaret approached it slowly, lantern held high. Duke pressed against her leg the way he always did when he sensed something mattered. She knelt. She did not open it, not yet. Outside, the storm broke fully over the mountain, with a violence that shook loose snow down through cracks in the stone above her, and Margaret understood, with a certainty that settled deep in her chest, that whatever this cave held, she was not leaving it again until the blizzard chose to release her. She built a small fire from the wood she'd carried in her pack, careful and economical the way Thomas had taught her, and set her back against the cold stone wall with Duke curled tight against her side for warmth. The chest sat 3 feet away, patient, unhurried, as though it had waited long enough already that one more night would cost it nothing. "We'll open it in the morning," she told Duke, who thumped his tail once against the stone floor, and whether that was agreement or simple comfort at the sound of her voice, Margaret could not say. Sleep came slowly, the wind screaming outside the cave mouth like something with a grievance against the whole mountain, and Margaret lay awake a long while thinking of the cabin she would never see again, of Thomas's hands on the timber beams, of Otis Mead's careful, regretful voice explaining why none of that mattered anymore. When she finally woke, gray light filtered faintly through some unseen crack far above, enough to tell her that morning had come even if the storm had not yet relented. Duke was already awake, sitting upright beside the chest, watching it the way he might watch a rabbit hole he expected something to emerge from. "All right," Margaret said. "All right, I hear you." The lock crumbled apart in her hands the moment she applied any real pressure, decades of rust giving way all at once, and the lid groaned upward on hinges that had not moved in longer than Margaret had been alive. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth gone brittle and yellow with age, she found a leather-bound journal, a small pouch that clinked with the unmistakable weight of coin, and a folded piece of paper marked with faded ink lines that resolved, once she smoothed it flat, into a hand-drawn map of the very mountain she now sat inside. She opened the journal first. The handwriting was cramped but careful, the ink faded to brown, and the first legible page bore a date that made Margaret's breath catch. 1841. 40 years before her own arrival in this cave, another person had sat in this same dry hollow, writing by firelight, waiting out some trouble of their own. The name at the top of the page read simply, Rosalind Hart. My husband is 3 days buried, and I have nowhere the town will let me stand, the first entry read. They have taken the claim in his name and told me a widow has no right to hold ground she did not file for herself. I have come up into the mountain because I would rather die free on this rock than beg in that town for a kindness they have already decided not to give me. Margaret sat very still, the fire crackling low beside her, and read the words again. She thought of Otis Mead's careful, regretful voice, 40 years removed from whatever men had once told Rosalind Hart the same cruel arithmetic, and felt something cold and old settle into her chest that was not quite grief and not quite recognition, but something living in the space between the two. There's something in the second half of this journal, she said aloud, to Duke, to the cave, to no one at all, and I think we ought to know what it is before this storm lets us leave. Outside the wind screamed on, unrelenting, patient as the mountain itself, and Margaret Coyle turned the page. The next several entries, written across what Margaret guessed had been the better part of a hard winter, told the story of a woman building a life alone in a place no one expected her to survive. Rosalind Hart had come from the Eastern Territories with her husband, a prospector chasing rumors of silver in these same mountains, and when a rockslide took his life before the first snow of their second year, the town below had moved with a swiftness that still, 40 years later, radiated off the page like heat from a stove. They say the claim reverts to the company, since I hold no paper in my own name, Rosalind had written. I have asked them to show me the law that says a woman's labor beside her husband counts for nothing once he is in the ground. No one has yet produced it. I suspect that is because it does not exist, and they have simply decided it should. Margaret felt her jaw tighten reading it. The shape of the injustice, so familiar, it might have been lifted whole from her own last week. Rosalind had not gone quietly. The journal traced, in spare and unsentimental language, how she had located this same cave, hauled supplies up the mountainside, a load at a time, and spent that first brutal winter proving, mostly to herself, that she required no man's permission to remain alive in country that had already tried once to kill her. Found a vein today, one entry read, dated deep into that first winter. Not silver, something else entirely, paler, heavier in the hand than it ought to be. I do not yet know what I have found. I know only that it is mine, found on ground no company paper claims, in a cave no map admits exists. Margaret's fingers stilled on the page. She looked toward the small leather pouch still resting in the chest, unopened, and for a long moment simply listened to the wind outside, to Duke's steady breathing beside her, to the particular silence of a mountain holding its secrets close. She opened the pouch. Inside, nestled in cloth gone soft with age, sat a handful of pale, heavy nuggets that caught the firelight with a dull, unmistakable gleam. Not silver. Margaret had seen enough silver in her years near the mining camps to know the difference immediately. This was gold. Rough and unrefined, exactly the kind of find that could remake a person's entire fortune overnight, sitting forgotten in an iron chest for 40 years because the woman who found it had never made it back down the mountain to claim it. Margaret's hands trembled, and beside her, Duke lifted his head and looked toward the cave's entrance with the same still, focused attention he'd shown the day before on the ridge. "What happened to you?" Margaret whispered. "To the journal, to Rosalind Hart, to the dry stone chamber that had kept this secret so carefully for so long. Why did you never come back for it?" She turned another page and found her answer waiting. The entries grew shorter as the winter deepened, the handwriting less steady, the tone shifting from defiant to something closer to weary endurance. Rosalind had found her gold, but finding it and surviving to spend it, Margaret understood with a sinking certainty, were two entirely separate accomplishments in country this unforgiving. "Supplies run low," one entry read. "I dare not go down while the pass holds this much snow. I have enough for perhaps 2 more weeks if I am careful. I have hidden the gold well enough that even if I do not survive to spend it, no one who does not deserve it will ever stumble across it by accident." Margaret's throat tightened. She read on. The final entries described a growing illness, some fever caught from the cold and the damp that Rosalind Hart had no medicine to fight. And the last full page, dated in a hand grown shaky and uneven, contained only a handful of lines. "If anyone ever finds this, know that I did not die begging that town for anything. I died on ground I found myself, having proven what I set out to prove. If you are a woman standing where I once stood, take what is here and build something they cannot take from you a second time. Do not let them tell you a widow is nothing. We are the ones who survive what they leave behind." Beneath that final entry, someone else's hand, cruder and less practiced, had added a single additional line, written in a different ink entirely. "Found her peaceful, spring thaw. Buried her proper on the south slope. Left the chest as she wanted it left. A man ought to respect a woman's dying wish, even one he never met." Margaret sat with the journal open in her lap for a long while, the fire burning low, Duke's head resting heavy and warm against her thigh, and felt something break open in her chest that had been sealed tight since the morning Otis Meade had explained, so carefully and so regretfully, exactly how little her 11 years of marriage counted for in the eyes of men who kept the ledgers. She was not the first woman this mountain had tried to erase. She would not be the last, if the world continued on its current course. But Rosalind Hart had left her something more valuable than gold alone. She had left proof in her own steady hand that a woman abandoned by every institution meant to protect her could still find a way to stand. The storm broke on the 3rd morning, the wind finally exhausting itself against the mountain's shoulders, and Margaret emerged from the cave mouth into a world scoured clean and white, The forest below transformed into a silent, glittering expanse that stretched all the way to the gray smudge of Hollow Creek on the horizon. Duke bounded out ahead of her, delighted by the fresh snow in the particular unguarded way dogs manage even in the hardest of circumstances. And Margaret stood a long moment at the cave's entrance, the chest secured now in a canvas sack across her shoulders, and looked down at the town that had decided she was worth nothing at all. She thought about walking back down that mountain and simply disappearing into some other territory entirely, gold in hand, never giving Otis Meade or anyone else in Hollow Creek the satisfaction of knowing what she had found. Some tired, wounded part of her wanted exactly that. But Rosalind Hart had not run from that town's cruelty. She had stayed on the mountain and built something they could not take from her, close enough that her survival stood as its own quiet answer to every man who had told her no. Margaret decided, standing there with the wind finally gone still, and Duke circling back to press against her leg, that she would do the same. The walk down took the better part of the day, the mule picking its way carefully through drifts that reached its knees in places. And by the time Margaret reached the outskirts of Hollow Creek, the sun had begun its slow slide toward evening, painting the snow in shades of gold that felt, to her, entirely too fitting for the occasion. She went first to the bank, because there was a particular satisfaction in doing things in the order that mattered most. Otis Meade looked up from his ledger with an expression that shifted in the space of a few seconds from mild surprise to poorly concealed alarm as Margaret set the canvas sack down on his desk with a heavy, deliberate thud. "Mrs. Coyle," he said, "I confess I did not expect to see you again so soon. I had assumed you had moved on to family, or—" "I found something in the mountains, Mr. Meade," Margaret said, and opened the sack just enough to let him see the dull gleam inside. "I would like to settle my late husband's debt in full today, and I would like the deed to my cabin returned to my name and my name alone." Otis Meade's mouth opened and closed twice before any sound emerged. "That is," he said, "that is a considerable amount of gold, Mrs. Coyle. I would need to have it assayed, of course, verified, before I could possibly agree to any transaction of this size." "Then have it assayed," Margaret said evenly. "I have all the time in the world now, Mr. Meade. I imagine you understand why." The assay, conducted 2 days later by a man brought in specially from the territorial office, confirmed what Margaret had already known in her bones the moment she'd opened that pouch inside the cave. The gold was pure, plentiful, and worth considerably more than the modest debt the bank had used to seize her home in the first place. Word travels fast in a town the size of Hollow Creek, and by the time Margaret walked back into the general store to settle her account there as well, the whispers had already reached every corner of the settlement. The widow Coyle had found something up in the mountains. The widow Coyle had walked into the bank and paid off her husband's entire debt in gold nuggets pulled from some cave nobody in town had ever mapped. She did not explain herself to anyone who asked, and plenty asked. She paid what she owed, reclaimed the deed to her cabin, and used a portion of what remained to purchase, outright and in her name alone, the parcel of mountain land that contained both the cave and whatever remained of the vein Rosalind Hart had discovered 40 years before her. The town's attitude toward Margaret Coyle underwent a transformation that she observed with a kind of tired, clear-eyed amusement. Men who had barely nodded to her on the street before now tipped their hats with elaborate courtesy. Women who had whispered behind their hands about a widow living alone with only a dog for company now invited her to church socials with a warmth that had been entirely absent 11 months earlier. Margaret accepted none of it with any particular gratitude. She had learned from Otis Meade's careful, regretful voice, and from Rosalind Hart's 40-year-old handwriting alike, exactly how quickly a town's opinion of a woman could shift in either direction, depending entirely on what she had to offer them. She did, however, make one visit that mattered more to her than any other. On a clear morning in early spring, with the last of the mountain snow retreating up toward the peaks, Margaret walked up to the cave one final time, Duke trotting ahead of her along a path that had become familiar over the preceding weeks. She carried with her a small marker, carved plain and simple, and a fresh bundle of the season's first wildflowers. She found the south slope Rosalind's unnamed benefactor had mentioned in that final journal entry. A gentle rise of ground with a clear view down over the forest and the distant smudge of the town below. And there, after a careful search through undergrowth that had reclaimed most traces of any grave, she found a low, weathered stone, its markings worn nearly smooth by 4 decades of weather. Margaret knelt beside it and set the marker she'd brought into the ground alongside the old stone, plain words carved into its face. Rosalind Hart. She survived what they left behind. "I read every word," Margaret said quietly, to the grave, to the mountain, to the woman whose courage had reached forward across 40 years to save a stranger she would never meet. "I did exactly what you asked. I built something they can't take from me a second time." Duke settled beside her, quiet and watchful, and together they sat a long while in the spring sunlight, looking down over the valley that had once tried to erase them both. The following months brought changes that rippled outward from that single afternoon in the bank. Margaret hired 2 men from town to help her work the claim properly, insisting on fair wages and fair treatment in a way that made at least a few of Hollow Creek's more established mining operations distinctly uncomfortable. She rebuilt the cabin Thomas had first raised with his own hands, expanding it modestly, adding a proper hearth and a second room that she filled, eventually, with books and a writing desk of her own. She kept the journal. She read it again some evenings by firelight, tracing Rosalind Hart's careful, defiant handwriting with the same reverence she might have shown a family heirloom, because in every way that mattered, it had become exactly that. Otis Meade, for his part, never quite regained the easy authority he had once wielded over Margaret's affairs. She conducted her banking business now with a courtesy exact and precise enough to make clear, without a single unkind word ever spoken, that she remembered exactly what he had said to her in that back room 11 months earlier, and that she had not forgiven it simply because circumstances had shifted in her favor. Years later, Travelers passing through the territory would sometimes hear the story told in the saloon or around a campfire. The tale of the widow who found a fortune in a cave her dog had led her to during a blizzard. Though by then, the details had blurred and shifted the way stories always do with enough retelling. Few of those tellings mentioned Rosalind Hart by name. Fewer still understood that the true fortune Margaret Coyle had carried down off that mountain was not the gold at all, but the simple, unbreakable proof that a woman left with nothing could still find her own way to stand. The cabin still stands today, weathered but sound, and the mountain still holds its cave 50 feet deep into the rock, dry and quiet, waiting the way mountains always wait, patient beyond the reckoning of any single human lifetime. If this story of quiet courage and hard-won survival moved you, consider staying a while longer with stories like it. Like this video, subscribe for more tales of frontier grit and unexpected grace. And tell us in the comments what you would have done, standing at the mouth of that cave with a storm at your back and a fortune waiting in the dark.